of all, how are you? How are you
Very
feeling?
well. Thank you for asking. It's such a pleasure to reconnect with you after almost a year since I was last in Sofia. It's really nice to see you, and I'm glad and would like to congratulate you for like taking this initiative to start this um, transnational conversation as a current crisis merits, because there's increasingly felt a need to sort of come together across state borders to come up with like potential solutions, be it in terms of discourse, be it in terms of active measures and policies that needs to be effected on ground.
Because you're now in New Delhi, tell us what's going on there and how do you experiencing the crisis and how or what are the implications for the art world there?
Mhm. To give you like a quick context, on the 22nd of March, the Prime Minister of the country, Narendra Modi, he announced sort of like a self-imposed voluntary Janta curfew. And immediately following, on the 24th, he put in motion a 21-day lockdown, which was to last on the 14th of April, which was further extended now until the 3rd of May. So it's been hailed as one of the most radical sort of measures taken by any government in terms of like closing down the economy, and the drasticness of this measure and the different implications it has on like all the sectors and uh, all the different people who have to sort of like get used to its functioning. Um, and I think in some ways that has helped in slowing down the spread of the pandemic, but there have been nonetheless problems on the ground with regards to its implementation and the gaps that started featuring within. So, for instance, a lot of like migrant workers weren't accounted for when such a lockdown was announced. So the result of it was that they lost their daily wage because they rely on like daily wage to sort of like make their ends meet. And once everyone was under lockdown, they could no longer get it. And then the urge was to sort of like uh, migrate back to their villages to be close to their families, as anyone who is in such a situation would naturally want to. And then, of course, like all the state borders were closed, so there wasn't any transportation. And what one saw was this grand exodus of people and sort of overcrowding of uh, some state bus terminals, which were subsequently opened to sort of ferry these people across. But even so, a lot of them ended up walking all the way back to their villages, sometimes up to like hundreds of miles in conditions of like starvation, of not having enough water, and they're migrating with like young kids and with their luggage. So there was a lot of that. There was also a disruption of essential food supplies towards the starting of the lockdown. So I think this is like the general sort of overview of where we are at in the country. When it comes to arts, things have been I would say a bit similar, but also a bit different. The difference sort of arises from the fact that we do not rely so much on state funding for the arts in India. And consequently, to my knowledge, I don't think there is any package or economic stimulus that's been announced for the gig workers or like different sort of members of the art organizations. The sameness is in terms of galleries and other independent practitioners um, implementing measures to sort of like uh, adapt their programming to the current situation and sort of like uh, in a way there has been a scramble to jump onto the bandwagon of digitization and sort of like going on virtual spaces and making the most of like the resources on the internet, be it in terms of like organizing walkthroughs of exhibitions or making sort of like artist talks and a podcast available online, but also some virtual exhibitions and even collaborative ones, let's say between Delhi and Dubai. Some galleries have come together to try and organize like collaborative viewing rooms after the Basel model exhibitions on Artsy. Others have sort of launched more radical strategies with the digital. So there's a gallery called Experimenter in Kolkata, in the eastern part of the country, and they have uh, sort of announced a whole slew of online programs. There's this one called Generator, whereby they are organizing sort of like a cooperative fund for the production in arts. So they're offering like mini bursaries to artists to keep active and productive during this time by making them uh, by availing them a small bursary. And they're not really, they're keeping it open in the sense they're not really making it oriented towards production. The artists are free to use this fund as and how they need it. So a model similar to, let's say, your Mondrian fund or some of the other funds, which are sort of like more sort of like free-handed in their giving of the money. And then the other thing that they're doing is called Black Box, which is like an online platform for interdisciplinary digital projects. So they are like announcing calls uh, to sort of like these kind of like different digital projects from artists. They're also organizing something called Filament, which is an online film and video programming that they have proposed, and there they would be sort of like inviting artists and filmmakers to put up their content online. Uh, then there's like something called Deep Dive, where they're organizing conversations with artists, but also people who are close to those artists and who have a specific insight into their practices. So, making uh, footage of studio visits with these artists, and also like conversations which can pull out uh, strands from their practice and process. I think what's sort of interesting to note here is how, for some galleries, the the digital or the virtual is just another space, like a temporary measure uh, to sort of carry on their business online, because in the lockdown, the gallery is not open, so they can't carry it out in the physical space. So for them, it's just a model to sort of like move it to an online space. Whereas other galleries are thinking with this new format and thinking of the implications of it. Why are we in this position? And since we are here, what can we do differently that is sort of more in tune with the reason why we are here and with the times. So that is like an interesting distinction to note in terms of how commercial galleries are approaching their digital exhibitions. Then, of course, we have like people, independent curators like Meenakshi Tirukode, who's also based out of Delhi, who's organizing a series of lectures and master classes in curation online. And she is sort of reaching out to some of her contacts, and some of these master classes also find their extension in these conversations that she has with other cultural practitioners that she has worked with in the past, and they pull out like different aspects of our organizing in the current times in India. So yesterday she was talking about something called structural cannibalism, um, in relation to experimenters online programming, which I was just mentioning how they've announced a slew of different online programs. And it's almost like overpowering when you sort of like come across these 7, 8 different sort of full powered strategy to go digital. So she was talking about structural cannibalism in the sense of how some of these bigger players, which are institutions or commercial galleries, by way of uh, sort of like undertaking in a way more than what is anybody's due, sort of take the opportunity away from independent practitioners who might feel that they no longer have or they would no longer garner the same visibility or reach through their own initiative because a bigger space has taken on the challenge now. So in a way, it's sort of like an or if they have to sort of like go through it, they will have to go through it via this circuit, which is co-opted by a gallery or an institution. Like other sort of like responses, there's something called FAQ art, which is like a bunch of two collectors who are trying to sort of like stimulate a young collector base by sort of recording interviews with established curators and gallery owners.
But I find it very interesting that what you mentioned about power relations and how this transition now from analog to digital is reflecting the same power relations that we already had in the art world. And do you think that we can actually use this transition to digital in order to correct some of the mistakes of the art world, or we're just going to replicate them again and again?
Um, I think replication is in the nature of how we move forward. Um, Butler talks about like repetition. So repetition is sort of like uh, it's a matter of course, but the positive or the hopeful arises in moments between each repetition because that's where uh, the possibility or the potential for change could be introduced. Like each repetition could sort of vary from its previous iteration, and that's where the potential lies. And I think in a realistic sense, and like I'm already mentioning, it is like the institutional players and people with like means and resources who are able to sort of immediately uh, move on to these new infrastructures of display. Um, for an independent practitioner, I would say it's still sort of like a bit of a leap to be able to amass the kind of resources uh, to uh, to move on to this new format. Like a young independent curator who has been sort of working with activating independent alternative spaces may not have the means to sort of build a virtual platform to do an exhibition or to organize something digitally, right? But of course, there are like different gradations of it. We're talking about like technology that's expensive, but I think uh, what could be interesting is like the the huge potential for innovation that this format enables. You not only have to do something that's coded and that's expensive or uh, sort of resource heavy in terms of organizing on the digital. There could be options that are like cheaper and more rudimentary or more improvisational. So I would say like it could go either way. It really depends on uh, who sort of like takes the takes the plunge first. Is it the need of the galleries to keep relevant and to keep alive, or is it like the need of the artists to speak the truth to power? That sort of like becomes more urgent. So I think it would be a matter of urgency and it would be determined thence.
You were appointed as curator of the American Biennale, and on the practical level, what's going on there, and do you know if and how it will happen? But on a more conceptual level, what would be the role of such big events in the art world in general?
Mhm. So with regards to my own Biennale, things are in a bit of suspended animation right now because um, it's kind of not the most appropriate time to reach out to people for funding. And uh, until that is clarified, we can't sort of take our conversations forward with the artists. But I think what can be more productive in terms of the thinking and the planning of the biennales is uh, on a discursive level, like what kind of discourses or dialogues can biennale enable, and how effectively can they plug in some of the serious questions of our times. This is like a good time for these big non-commercial institutions to put some of these questions through and work on formats that can deepen the scope of that outreach rather than thinking about how they can make biennales without doing it physically if this lasts that long, to focus instead more on how they can make the outreach more relevant.
And in the end, of course, I would like to ask you the question that is maybe already a total cliche, but still, how do you imagine the world and the art in, I don't know, 1, 2, 5, 6 months? I mean, after the crisis, do you think that we'll just continue the way we lived, or is it going to be new and different?
So there are like few things that can be said. Like one of the questions that can be raised is whether we would see the continuation of some of the digital technologies that are emerging, some of the innovations in virtual ways of encountering art. We can question whether those would continue post the restoration of normalcy. Um, my hunch here is that virtual has is plausibility right now because we are in this crisis and we don't have an option. But I think there's something that's inherently solipsistic about that consumption. When you consume media sitting at your home in the comfort of your room or in the comfort of your personal space, uh, the possibility of having a social or communal encounter, which would be available in a museum setting or in a public art institution, like a biennale, or even in like a movie theater, that possibility is missing. Uh, I feel that that is something that's essential and core to uh, to the practice of art and of exhibition. So this move towards the digital, there's like a culmination of the archival impulse, as it were. Like there is sort of this sense that things are becoming archived even before they are encountered. And I feel that there's something that's a bit sort of unsatisfying about that encounter. There's something that lacks in that encounter, and there's something that is sort of incomplete or um, that needs questioning about this archival impulse or this overdrive of the digital, as it were, because when you're applying so much of digital data, and with the problem of the archival impulse itself, with the archival impulse itself, we know this problem of forgetting, of being overwhelmed, of not being able to sort of consume anything because we're bombarded with everything. All of our apocalyptic scenarios and the end of the world scenarios and all that we imagine sort of work with the notion of light at the end of the tunnel. There is a sense that right now we're in this crisis, but the very resource that we have to fight this or to overcome this crisis is reliant on our ability or this outward movement of being able to come out of it someday at some time. And I think this is really the key to understanding what things would be like in all probability once we emerge from this crisis. I think people would sort of welcome being out again and being able to encounter art in public spaces and be able to sort of like make some kind of like a social affinity or like a kinship of viewing with the spectators that accompany them in that space. Right now, what we see is like some of the commercial gallery practices. What they do is um, the works that they're showing or the practices that they're encouraging are not necessarily rooted because they're dictated by a commercial agenda. I think those would be sort of pushed to support practices that are a bit more rooted and a bit more situated. So if I were to explain this by way of an example, my father always tells me to sort of like start cultivating my garden with small saplings and seeds rather than going for like fully potted and blooming plants. And I think there's sense to it because when you start something small and sort of like are invested in its development and in its production, there's a way in which it becomes localized and it becomes rooted uh, and grounded. So what I'm trying to say through this example is like commercial galleries who have been using this model of importation and sort of like implanting because there is a sort of a purchase or a value in sort of like importing something that's hip in the international art scene and then sort of like doing it in a local context. They would be forced to uh, think with practices that are more situated.
Thanks a lot for that conversation. It was super interesting to talk with you and to also find out what's going on there in this context that right now seems so distant. Like, I don't know, like everything seems like very distant right now. Like we're like in our small rooms, in our small apartments, and everything besides that feels to be very far away. Thanks a lot, and I really hope that we'll soon meet again in person, hopefully, and stay healthy. And thanks a lot again.
Thank you so much.
Ciao.
Ciao.